Hey, fellow Hebrew travelers. Just want to give you some supplemental information on some of the other verbal patterns that we didn't cover in class. So here's our list of the most common biblical Hebrew verbs or the verb patterns that we have. We've covered the vast majority in terms of number and frequency of verbs in the system, but we'd like to kind of clean up and also talk about some of these miscellaneous categories. And then you'll notice way, way, way on the right, we have others. So there are categories that maybe have one or two verbs in their quote unquote category. So that sort of depends on how linguists slice and dice the language. So whether you have enough verbs to constitute a category, I guess, is up to someone else. But we'll talk about some of the more major minor categories. And the first pattern we'd like to talk about is Hithpael. You'll notice that Hithpael is productive in all the verbal forms except for infinitive absolute. So it's kind of the next major minor pattern. How to identify Hithpael, which shows up 842 times in the Bible. We have this pattern, so it's not totally uncommon. I think the way that most students identify Hithpael is just due to the fact that the verb looks so darn long. Like there's way too much going on in this word and something's up. So if you ever find yourself having that sense that this word is just too long, it could be due to object suffixes like we studied, but it could also be one of these more obscure verbal patterns. The Hithpael marks the pattern with the hey taf combination at the beginning of the word. So remember, right now, for at least we're dealing with perfect verbs. So remember, suffixes indicating person, number, and gender show up at the end of the word. So like hifil is marked with a hey at the beginning of the verb, and nifal is marked with a nun at the beginning of the verb. The Hithpael is marked with two letters, so a hey and a taf at the beginning of the verb. So hit halech. And here's our root, hey lamed kaf, which, as I hope you remember, means to go or to walk. The perfect form, the third masculine singular form, isn't marked with a suffix, as you would imagine. So the perfect forms work exactly like all of the other perfect forms that you've studied in this class. Same suffixes. So the first common singular, just to show you some examples, we won't go through the whole paradigm because the forms are hard to find in the Bible. But anyway, here's some that I found. So the hit halachti is marked with a hey and a taf at the beginning, and then a t, a taf and a yod at the end, a herrick vowel. And it's just exactly like the first common singular of any other perfect verb in the language, except this one is marked with a hey and a taf at the beginning. Third common plural, just so that you can take a look at this, is marked with a hey and a taf at the beginning, and then an oo vowel, as we would expect in any perfect verb. And the Vav consecutive works just the same as imperfect. So instead of hith, we have the typical prefixes for Vav consecutive and imperfect. So, and he halakt would be vayit halech. Nothing really unusual there. So the yod marks a third masculine singular, just like we would expect in any Vav consecutive. The imperfects, third masculine singular, yet halech. First common singular, et halech. So we have an aleph marking the first common singular, just like any other imperfect. The tav remains. And the third masculine plural, yet halachu. So we have the yod marking masculinity, and then the u vowel marking plurality at the end of the verb. So these work just like any imperfect, except that the hey in the pattern and the perfect is replaced by these typical perfect prefixes. So the hey, if you want to think about it this way, they tacked on the prefix, the hey dropped out, no big surprise there, and we end up with these with forms that look like this. So how do we translate them? Again, the best option is always to look them up in the dictionary, and then you have a pretty firm idea. But if you're sort of translating on the run, here are three typical ways that Hithpael is translated. So just to give you an example, hit halech, the verb we've been working with, means to walk around, to stroll, to wander to and fro. So this is what Yahweh does in the garden in Genesis chapter 3. When it gets cool in the evening, then Yahweh does this thing in the garden. And the sense is that he's not going from point A to point B. It's not a journey. It's not a direct journey, but just sort of walking around, checking things out, enjoying the day, kind of walking. So it's different than going from I don't know, Jerusalem to Jericho. It's not that kind of walking. So sometimes this people associate or linguists associate the Hithpael with iterativity. So an action, so iterativity just means doing something again and again, or doing something back and forth. So think doing something over and over, sort of like the Greek imperfect in a way, the idea of habitual action, it could fall into that. The next category is reflexivity, so doing something to themselves, like dressing yourself, or doing something to each other, like blessing each other, could be in this verbal pattern. And then occasionally, not that often, but every once in a while, just to keep life a little confusing, keep you on your toes, it's the Hithpael takes on a passive meaning, which we wouldn't expect. We would expect that to be the language to do that in a different way, but it doesn't. So every once in a while, they're just passives. We have in this pattern kind of an odd thing in the language, which is sort of interesting from a linguistic standpoint, but something that can be confusing if you're trying to parse and you don't have a lot of resources around you. So let's look at this verb. So it's hishtagea, and I'll tell you up front that this is a Hithpael verb. So we would expect a hey followed by a taf followed by the root, and that's not what we see in this case. So the hey and the taf are actually separated by the first root letter. So these letters. And you might be familiar with this root, Shin Gimel Ayin, from the Yiddish word Meshugana, or the Hebrew word Meshuga, which means somebody that's insane, sort of craziness in kind of a slangy sort of way. But anyway, that's what this root means. But it seems that instead of getting the hey and the taf tacked on at the beginning of the word, there was a flip between the shin and the taf. So instead of hey, taf, shin, we have hey, shin, taf, and then the rest of the root. Now, if you think about it, this kind of makes sense, or it's something you can get your head around. So if we'd done it the other way, if we had made this into a Hithpael, it would be something like Hithshagea. And I know linguists are kind of hesitant to talk about situations in language like, well, that was hard to say, so they did it this other way. Pointing out that, gosh, and there's a lot of languages where things are hard to say, and people pull them off all the time. So that's not a really good excuse, but you can kind of see how Hishtagea took off and how Hitshagea didn't really take off. So in cases where the first letter of the root makes an S sound, like a shin or a sin, or like a tsade, a TS sound, or a samek, you will see this process of metastasis, or this kind of where letters sort of float off and they go and they do things on their own. So this happens. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen in the language in places. Now, our next category that we'll talk about is the Hishtafel. So that's kind of getting way off over to the right here in our chart. So we just have Vav consecutives and imperfects. So we only have one root for this particular vowel pattern. And the root is Het Vav He. So in one way, that's really fortunate because this is sort of just a verb on its own, and it means to bow down. So he bowed down would look like this: Hishtahave, or Hishtahava, excuse me. Now you might be able to intuit already that with a root like Het Vav He, this could be problematic because we know that middle Vav kind of does some strange things. We know that third He does some strange things. And yes, it is kind of a problem verb. So in this case, instead of having a prefix marked by a he or a nun, or I should say a vowel pattern marked by he or a nun, or a he and a tav, and then the root, we get kind of yet another thing. We get a he, a shin, and a tav that mark the pattern. So again, this has nothing to do with person, number, or gender. This is just showing you that it's a hishtafel verb. And actually, when linguists talk about this verb, they even kind of wonder if maybe at some point this was hit shafel or something like that, where the shin and the taf were flipped around at some point in the development of the language. So we've already seen how S sounds and these tavs don't kind of commingle very well. So that's kind of speculation. And because we just have one verbal pattern as examples, we just have to speculate as to what might have happened there. But anyway, it looks like this pattern. And again, the verb just looks super, super, like way too long. Like something's going on here. And usually the context, makes sense in the context when people meet each other. So-and-so bowed down to this angel or to Yahweh or something like that. So they're also fairly easy to identify. So we have the hish, ta, as marking the pattern, and then we have the root, he, vav, het, vav, he, as the root. So in the vav consecutive, we have vayish, tachu. So just two root letters left because in vav consecutive, third he drops away. So this verb behaves like all other verbs in the language. It's just that there's a lot of stuff at the beginning that you have to plow through to even get to a root. So sometimes that throws students of Hebrew off. And just to show you the insanity here, here's what the third plural looks like: Vayishtachavu. So the he and the vav stay there, but we have the u final ending. All right, so some of our other patterns that we need to talk about just briefly. So looking at our chart again, we've talked about how Kal and Nifal are sort of related. So Kal is, in general, the active pattern, and Nifal is the passive pattern. So remember the difference between active and passive. So think back to our discussion about that, and I'll show you some examples so you can remind yourself of what the differences are there. Now, I've kind of made the story slightly easier than what it actually is in real life. For call, there are actually two passive patterns. So one is the Nephal, which is far, far, far and away the most common. But there is also a pattern that's called call passive that also does the same things. It takes a verbal action expressed in a root and it makes it passive. And you might ask yourself, well, why did there need to be two? And I haven't put call passive even on the chart because it's confusing and obscure. Um, and most linguists would say that at some point in the development of the language, probably the older part of the language, the way to express passive was through call passive, and then eventually the language developed this other form, which was the Nephal, and Nephal really took off and became popular, and cal passive sort of dropped away and fell out of the language or fell out of use. And sometimes this is a way that linguists can look at a text in Biblical Hebrew, just as an aside, look at a text and say, maybe this is an older text because this uses the call passive. That might lead us in the direction of thinking that a text is older. We also have similar matches in the language between active and passive. So we've talked about PL, and PL has a passive form that's called pual. And you probably guess where this is going. Hifil actually has a passive form, a matching passive form that is called hofal. So call's most common passive is Nephal, although there are also call passives. PL's passive form is pual, and Hifil's passive form is hofal. So just to show you some examples of what these look like. Here's a call verb, yalad, which means to bear or to beget in kind of old King James English. So he begat would be yalad. But to say he was begotten would be yulad. You might remember back when we talked about call passive participles and how I said the way you can easily pick up on a passive participle is through this oo vowel, although in that case the oo vowel showed up between the second and third root letter. And here in the call passive, we have an example where it shows up between the first and the second root letter, so yulad. But just as a general rule, when you see this oo vowel showing up in between root letters, or you see this three-dot kibbutz vowel, which we haven't encountered a whole lot, but it does show up in these passive forms. If you see this oo vowel floating around anywhere kind of among the three root letters, chances are very, very, very good that it is a passive form of some type. So if you know what the root meaning is and you see an oo vowel, think passive, and maybe before you look it up to try to really see what the meaning is, if you're just translating on the fly, give it a passive meaning and you'll probably be correct. So there are 1,057 call passives, not just this verb in the Biblical Hebrew, or Hebrew Bible, I should say. So they're not totally uncommon. However, I will say that this yulad, this to be begotten, is far and away the most common verb. So if I took out the yulads, I'm not really sure how many other forms there would be left. So this is a super common form, but I don't know how often it really appears. So we have a PL verb that I don't think we studied specifically in terms of vocab, kippur, so yom kippur, comes from this verb root, and it means to cover. So kiper is to cover. And kupar in the pual means to be covered. So this is the passive form. And there are 417 puals, identified puals in the Hebrew Bible. So not terribly common. But if you compare call passive and pual, they look awfully similar. So maybe a little bit difficult to tell apart. But your best bet is to look them up. And chances are, if you knew that kiper meant to cover, you would probably pick up on the fact that kupar is to be covered. Hifil, so it's harder to find examples in the Hebrew Bible of a hifil matched with a hofal. So I picked this one even though it's fairly confusing. So this is, as you might recall from our parsing exercise, this is the hifil form of yod shin bet, which means to sit or dwell. So this would be to make someone sit or dwell, cause to dwell. And that first yod changes into a vav when it goes into the hifil form. You might recall that. So the hifil form of this verb is hoshiv. And the hofal form is hushav. So again, we get this u vowel. So if you see a verb starting with hu, it could be hofal, although again, not terribly common in the biblical text. We have 392 of them by some count. So not awfully common, but they do exist. So I think the takeaway from these passive forms is that, again, if you see an u vowel in and amongst the root letters, that chances are it is some sort of passive, and then go to a dictionary or to other resources to see what kind of a passive verb it is. Now, there are some other oddballs, but you do encounter them. I think had one person who encountered an oddball verb in their translation project and dealt with it just fine. So it's not like these completely stump people usually. They get past them somehow. So there's one verbal pattern, polel, which shows up 180 times in Biblical Hebrew. And in the polel, these only apply, as far as I know, to verbs that are what we call middle weak, or in other words, verbs or roots where the middle letter is vav or yod. So we had our middle root here is kov vav mem, which means to stand up or rise up. But we have the final mem, or the third letter of the root, repeated. So in essence, in this form we have, you might think of it as 4 root letters, even though that's not a good way to think of it. It's a better thought that the third root letter is duplicated. So komemu is our verb here instead of komu. I guess if they hadn't repeated the final root letter. I don't know, again, you can sort of get your linguistic head around the fact that they didn't really care for yekomeu, and instead of went for yekomemu. And usually the letter, this typically shows up where the third root letter is a mem or a nun, so maybe that has something to do with it. And also this shows up way more common in biblical Hebrew poetry, so maybe they just liked the poetic sound of duplicating that last letter. No idea, but for better or worse, there it is. We also have polal, so instead of polel, polal, meaning that instead of a tsere vowel under the third root letter, we have kametz here. And there are 11 of these by some count in the Hebrew Bible. So konanu, and here the root letter that I don't think we had is kaf vav nun, which means to set up or establish. And again, the third root letter is repeated. And then we have another funky form, hit polel. Again, Sayao talks about all these in great detail, so if you want to know more, there's a lot more information there. So the hit polel combines the fun of hitpael with the duplication of the polel, and so we get both phenomenon. So this verb starts with a hit, like we would expect, and then we have a root, and this root is actually beit yod nun, which means to separate or differentiate between something and something else, to discern. So it comes into Hebrew in the Proverbs, a word like binah, which means discernment or wisdom. But in any event, the third root letter is duplicated. So we have both the hey and the tough at the beginning and the duplication of the third root letter. And again, I hope if you would encounter this word, you would think, wow, this word is super long. Maybe it's one of these odd verbal forms. So I think that to me is always the way to know that something's up with the verb. Anyway, I think these are all the obscure verbal forms that I want to talk about today. Hope if you're going on in Hebrew, this is fine, that you find this video helpful. Talk to you soon. Have a great day.